Chapter 24 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. Devlin's Promise. Half an hour later, the stone, reposing in a tin box of cigarettes, was in the mails on the way to Trent's camp at Kennebago. Mrs. Kenny had instructions to hold all mail, and its safety was thus assured. There was nothing more to fear. He wanted very much to know what had happened at Miss Thompson's apartment, and proposed to call after breakfast. But Devlin called first upon him. It was a depressed Devlin. Not indeed a Devlin come to be apologetic, but one less assured. "Well?" said Trent affably. "Come to search me again? I'm getting a little tired of it, my good man." "I want to know why you pass here under the name of Maltby of Chicago, when your name is Trent and you live in New York City." "A private detective has no right to demand any such knowledge. Last night you took upon yourself powers and authority which we could have resisted if we chose. You had no legal right to search us. I submitted first because I had nothing to fear, and secondly to see if the others had the stone. I didn't think they had." "What do you know about the stone?" Devlin demanded suspiciously. "Everything, except just where it is at this present moment. Between you and me, Devlin, I'm here after it too. I was at Groton, as can easily be proved, on the day after the murder." Trent smiled as a curious look passed over the detective's face. "I'm going to disappoint you. I passed the day and night in Boston when the murder was done. I have just as much use for that $10,000 as you have. By the way, I suppose you got the stone?" "Like hell I did!" Devlin cried, red in the face. "I got this." He showed Trent the piece of cut glass which had hung in his room for so long. "Glass, that's what it is." Devlin leaned forward and looked hard into Anthony Trent's eyes. "You know more about this than you pretend. It ain't accident that brings you around when two such stones as Dangerfield's ruby and this here emerald get stolen. There's something more to it than that. There's something mighty queer about you, Mr. Anthony Trent, and I'm going to see what it is." Trent looked at him for a moment and then smiled. It was the tolerant smile of the superior. It angered Devlin. His red face grew redder still. "My good Devlin," said Trent, "stupidity such as yours may be a good armor, but it is a poor diving suit." "Talk sense," Devlin commanded. "If you wish," Trent agreed easily. "I mean that you haven't the mental equipment to live up to your desires. You have the impertinence to think you can outwit me. I'm your superior in everything. Mentally, morally and physically I can beat you, and in your heart you know it. I think I've stood about as much from you as I care to take from any man. For a time you amused me. At Sunset Park you thought you were being very subtle, searching my room with your twin ass, O'Brien, but I was laughing at you." "You was drunk," said Devlin slowly. "That's how gin takes me," said the other. "I see the ludicrous in men and things. Just listen to me. My past and present bears investigation. You looked me up and you know." Trent drew his bow at a venture. "You found that out, didn't you?" "Because I couldn't find anything against you doesn't prove you're what you pretend," Devlin admitted grudgingly. "The point I wish to make is this," Anthony Trent said incisively. "I'm tired of you. You bore me. You weary me. You exasperate me. I'm willing to overlook your blundering stupidity this time, but if you worry me again I shall go after you so hard you'll wish you'd never heard my name. I've got money and that means influence. You've neither. Think it over. Now get out." Devlin looked at him doubtfully. There was a strong personal animus against Anthony Trent. He hated anything suave, smiling or polite, and when these qualities were in conjunction with physical prowess they spelled danger. But for the moment nothing was to be gained by violence. Devlin essayed a genial air. "We all of us make mistakes," he admitted. "I'm willing to say it. I'm sorry I've gone wrong over this case." He held out a big short fingered hand. "Goodbye." "What's the use?" Trent demanded. "You'll always be my enemy and I never shake hands with an enemy if I can get out of it." Devlin was at a loss for the moment. It had been his experience that when he offered a hand it was grasped gladly, eagerly. There was something in this harder, unsmiling Trent which impressed him against his will. "They shake hands before the last round of a prize fight," he reminded the other man. "So they do," said Trent, smiling a little, and offered his hand. 2 weeks later he was compelled to concede that Devlin's pertinacity sometimes won its reward. Devlin had always been an advocate of the third degree. Together with some operatives from his agency he staged a gruesome drama into which hysterical and frightened the drink-enervated Norah Thompson was dragged. Under the pitiless cross-examination of these hard men she broke down. Andrew Apthorpe's murderer was found. But the triumph was incomplete. She convinced them that although the emerald had been hers for a time, of its destination or present ownership she had no idea. She went into penal servitude for life with a newspaper notoriety that made the Takowaja emerald the most famous stone in existence. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. The expert has usually a critical sense well developed. It was so with Anthony Trent. He read the details of all the crimes treated in the daily press almost jealously. What the police regarded as clever criminals were seldom such in his eyes. There were occasionally crimes which won his admiration, but they were few and far between. Violence, to Trent's mind, was a confession of incompetency. The grammar school type of crime, to a university-trained mind. One morning the papers were unusually full of such examples of robberies with attendant assaults. Clumsy work, he commented. And then came to a robbery in Long Island of jewels whose aggregate value was more than $100,000. The home of Peter Chalmers Rosewarne at the Montauk Point end of Long Island was the victimized abode. All Americans knew Peter Chalmers Rosewarne. He was the Tin King, enormously wealthy, splendidly generous and fortune's favorite. His father had been a Cornish mining captain who had come from Hugh Bassett to make $1 million in the United States. His son had made 10 millions. His Long Island place, known as St. Michael's Mount, after that estate in Cornwall, near where his father had been born, was a show place. The gardens were extraordinary. The house was filled with treasures which only the intelligent rich may gather together. Rosewarne was a convivial soul in the best sense of the phrase. He loved company and he loved display, and more than all he loved his wife on whom he showered the beautiful things women adore. Abstractors of precious stones would gravitate naturally to such a home as his. Anthony Trent remembered that the Rosewarne strain of Airedales was the best the breed had to show. He'd read once that Rosewarne turned his dogs loose at night and laughed burglars to scorn. And well he might, for of all dogs the gods have blessed none with such sense as the Airedales possess. Theirs not to bark indiscriminately or bite their master's friends. Theirs to reason why, to know instinctively what is hidden from the lesser breeds. A dozen such dogs roaming their master's grounds, their guardian instincts aroused, would effectually bar out strangers. That a robbery had been committed at St. Michael's Mount spelled for Trent an inside job. The papers told him that a large house party was gathered under the hospitable Rosewarne roof. Rosewarne himself indignantly denied the possibility of his guest's guilt. The servants seemed equally satisfactory. Sifting the news, Anthony Trent learned that the suspected person was a girl who had been member of a picnic party using the Rosewarne grounds. There was a space of nearly 10 acres which the mining man had reserved for parties, suitably recommended, who made excursions from the Connecticut side of the Sound. Here Sunday schools passed blameless days and organized clambakes. The party to which the suspected girl belonged was a camp for working girls situated on one of the Thimble Islands. Nearly 40 of them, enjoying the privilege of the Rosewarne grounds, had spent the day there. Mrs. Rosewarne herself had seen them depart into the evening mist. Then she had seen, 30 minutes later, a girl running to the water's edge. She was dressed, as were the others of her party, with red trimmed midi blouse and red ribbons in her hair. A brunette, rather tall and slight, and awed when the chatelaine of the great estate asked what was the matter. It seemed she had become tired and had slept. When she awoke the boat was gone. She had not been missed. Mrs. Rosewarne was not socially inept enough to bring the simple girl to her own sophisticated dinner table. Instead, the girl had an ample meal in the housekeeper's room. At 9 o'clock a fast launch was to be ready to take her to her camp. It might easily overtake the sailboat if the breezes died down. At 9:15 the mechanician in charge of the boat came excitedly into the house to relate his unhappy experiences. The girl, wrapped in motor coat, was safely in the boat when she begged the man to get her a glass of water from the boathouse at the dock. It was while he was doing so that the boat disappeared. He heard her call to him in fright and then saw the boat, one capable of 20 knots an hour, glide away with the girl holding her hands out to him supplicatingly. She had fooled with the levers, he averred, and would probably perish in consequence. It was while Rosewarne considered the matter of sending out his yacht in pursuit that the discovery was made that $100,000 worth of jewels had been taken. The mechanician had been fooled, of that they were now assured, and the working girl became a fleeing criminal. The sudden temptation through seeing sparkling stones in profusion was the result. A number of boats went in pursuit and the ferries were watched, but the fast motor launch was not found. Considering the case from the evidence he had at command, Trent was certain it was no genuine member of the working girls' camp who had done this thing. Every move spoke of careful preparation. Someone had chosen a moment to appear at the Mount when suspicion would be removed and her coming seem logical. And no ordinary person would have been able to drive a high-powered boat as she had done. Another thing which seemed conclusive proof of his correctness was the fact that the girl had overlooked, this was as the police phrased it, Mrs. Simeon Power's pearl necklace and the diamond tiara belonging to Mrs. Campbell Glenelg. This omission supported the police theory that it was the work of an inexperienced criminal. Anthony Trent chuckled as he read this. He also had rejected the Powers pearls and the Glenelg tiara. They had been in his appraising hand. They were both extraordinarily good imitations. Assuredly a timid working girl could not be such a judge of this. She was a professional and a clever one. Probably she had sunk the launch and swam ashore. Later reports veered around to his view. The camp people were highly indignant at being saddled with a criminal. They had counted noses before embarkation and none was missing. Mrs. Rosewarne described the girl and so did the housekeeper. The latter, remarking on the slightly foreign intonation, was told by the girl herself that she came from New Bedford, where her father was employed in a textile mill belonging to Dangerfield. Like so many of the inhabitants of this mill town, he was of French-Canadian stock and habitually spoke French in the home. But the housekeeper, who had served the wealthy in England and continental Europe, would have it that this intruder come of a higher social class than New Bedford mills afford. Interviewing the housekeeper in the guise of a Brentford newspaper man, Trent asked her 100 questions, and each one of her answers confirmed the belief that had grown in him. This clever woman was the Countess. He felt certain of it. That slight intonation was hers. The figure, the height, the coloring. And of course the exact knowledge of what stones were good and what were not. This was another count against her, for Trent had marked St. Michael's Mount for his hunting ground, and now precautions against abstractors would be redoubled. He felt almost certain that this was the Countess's first exploit since her escape from the hotel after the Guestwick robbery. He had followed the papers too closely to miss any unusual crime. A woman of her breeding need never drop to association with the typical criminal. Since she was marooned in the United States during the war, she was of necessity cut off from her favorite Riviera hunting grounds. Where, then, might she meet the wealthy set if not among the owners of big estates on Long Island? Trent felt it probable that she was near some such social center as Meadowbrook or Piping Rock. How was he to find her? To begin with, he decided to attend the Mineola Horse and Dog Show. This country fair, held during late September, invariably attracted, as he knew, all the horse-loving, polo-riding elements of the smart set. Not to go there, not to be interested intelligently in horses, hounds and dogs was a confession of ineligibility to the great Long Island homes. Although he entertained the bare hope of seeing her and passed the first day in disappointment, he saw her almost directly he entered the show grounds on the second morning. She looked very smart in a riding habit. Her hair was done in a more severe coiffure than he had noticed before. She was talking to a well-known society woman, also in riding kit, a Mrs. Hamilton Buxton, famous for her horses and her loves. But he could not judge from this whether or not the Countess was on friendly terms with her or not. There is a camaraderie among those who exhibit horses or dogs which is of the ring side and not the salon. Outside it was possible Mrs. Hamilton Buxton might not recognize her. Later on he saw that both women were riding in the class for ladies hunters to be ridden side saddle by the owners. So the Countess owned hunters now. Well, he expected something of the sort from a woman who had outwitted so astute a craftsman as himself. In a sense he was glad of it. It was better to find her in such a set as this. When she rode around the ring he saw by the number she bore that she was a Madame de Beaulieu of Old Westbury. She rode very well. There was the haute école stamp about her work, and she was placed second to Mrs. Hamilton Buxton, whose chestnut was of a better type. Anthony Trent went straightway to New York. He did not want to be seen yet. He called up a certain number and made an appointment with a Mr. Moore. This man, David Moore, was a private detective without ambition and without imaginative talent. It always amused Trent when he employed a detective to find out details that were laborious in the gathering. In some subtle manner Trent had given Moore the impression that he was a Secret Service agent exceedingly high in the department. "Moore," he said briskly as the small and depressed David entered the room, "I want to find all about a Madame de Beaulieu who lives in Old Westbury, Long Island. I suspect her of being a German spy. Find out what other members of the household there are and who calls. Whether they are in society or only trying to be. I want a full and reliable report. The tradesmen know a whole lot as a rule and servants generally talk. I want to know as soon as possible, but keep on the job until you have something real." He knew that Moore, by reason of an amazingly large family, was always hard up. He handed him $50. "Take this for expenses." Moore went from the room with tears in his eyes. He looked at Trent as a loving dog looks at its master. 2 years before his wife lay at the point of death, needing more than anything a rest from household worries and the noise of her offspring. Trent sent her to a sanitarium and the children to camps for the whole of a hot summer. In his dull, depressed fashion, Moore was always hoping that some day he could do something to help this benefactor who waved his thanks aside. The report, written in Moore's small, clear writing, entertained Trent vastly. Madame de Beaulieu was a daughter of France whose husband was fighting as an officer of chasseurs and had been decorated thrice. Many pictures adorned the house of her hero. She had a French maid who allowed herself to be very familiar with her mistress. Undoubtedly she was the aunt of the Guestwick occasion. The men of the household were doubtful, according to Moore. One was Madame's secretary, an American named Edward Conway, who looked after her properties, and the other an Englishman, Captain Monmouth, a former officer of cavalry who had broken an ankle in a steeplechase, so the report ran, and was debarred from military service. He was a cousin by marriage. The servants asserted that he was an amazingly lucky player at bridge, or indeed of any card game. So much so indeed that the neighboring estate owners who had been inclined to be friendly were now stiffly aloof. The captain's skill at dealing was uncanny. Bills were piling up against them all. It was due largely to this that Moore was able to get so much information. A vituperative tradesman sets no watch on his tongue. Conway, the secretary, confined his work almost entirely to drinking. There were many bitter wrangles at the table, but the English tongue was never adopted on such occasions. The part of Moore's screed which interested Trent most was that there had been a discussion overheard by a disgruntled maid to take in some wealthy paying guest and offer to get him into Long Island's hunting set. It would be worth a great deal to an ambitious man to gain an entrée into some of these famous Westbury homes. Of course, the odd household could probably not live up to such promises, but its members had done a great deal. For example, a Sunday paper, in its photogravure supplement, had snapped Madame de Beaulieu talking with Mrs. Hamilton Buxton, and Captain Monmouth was there to be seen chatting with Wolfston Coleman, the great polo player. An excellent beginning, astutely planned. It was while Anthony Trent debated as to whether he dare risk the Countess's recognition of him that a wholly accidental circumstance offered him the opportunity. Suffering from a slightly inflamed neck, he was instructed to apply dioxygen to the area. This he did with such cheerful liberality that his shaving mirror next day showed him a man with black hair at the front and a vivid blonde at the back. The dioxygen had helped him to blondness as it had helped a million brunettes of the other sex. For a moment he was chagrined. Then he saw how it might aid. It was his intention to go back to Kennebago for the deer hunting, and accordingly he dispatched Mrs. Kinney post haste. She was used to these erratic commands and saw nothing out of the ordinary in the fact that he was in a bathrobe with a Turkish towel wound about his head. He was in dread of becoming bald and was continually fussing with his hair. In a day or so Anthony Trent was a changed being. His eyes had a hazel tint in them which formed not too startling a contrast to his new blondness. He was careful to touch up his eyebrows also. Shutting up his flat, he registered at a newly built hotel as Oscar Lindholm of Wisconsin. He would pass for what we assume the handsome type of Scandinavian to be. It was at this hotel Captain Monmouth stayed when he came to indulge in what he termed a flutter with the cards. There were still a few houses in the city where one could be reasonably sure of quiet. Hard-drinking youths were barred at these houses. They became quarrelsome. The men who played were in the main big business men who could win without exuberance or lose without going to the district attorney. They were invariably good players and lost only to the professionals. And their tragedy was that they could not tell a professional until the game was done. Captain Monmouth always excited in players of this type a certain spirit of contempt. He was so languid, so gently spoken, so bored at things, and he consumed so much Scotch whisky that he seemed primed for sacrifice. But he was never the altar's victim. He was always so staggered at his unexpected good fortune that he readily offered a revenge. A servant had told David Moore that the household was supported on these earnings. Captain Monmouth, stepping through the lounge on the way to his taxi, caught sight of Oscar Lindholm. Oscar was leaning against the bar rail talking loudly of the horse. 5 hours later Oscar was still standing at the bar and the horse was still his theme. Monmouth was a careful soul for all his gentle languors and sauntered into the tap room and demanded an Alexander cocktail. As became a son of Wisconsin, Oscar was free and friendly. The Alexander was a new one on him, he explained, dropping for a moment themes equine. Monmouth never made the mistake of offering friendship to a barroom stranger unless he knew exactly what he was and how he might fit into the Monmouth scheme of things. He referred Mr. Lindholm to the guardian of the bottles. It was the size of the Lindholm wad that decided Captain Monmouth to accept an invitation to a golden woodcock in the grill room. There it was that Lindholm opened his heart. He wanted to follow hounds from the back of a horse. "Well, why don't you, my good sir?" Monmouth replied languidly. For a moment a light of interest had passed across the dark blue eyes of the ex-cavalryman. Trent knew he was interested. Trent explained. he said that the following of hounds near New York was only possible to one who passed the social examination demanded by these who controlled the hunting set. "You're quite right," Monmouth admitted. "For the outsider it's impossible." "I'll show 'em," Oscar Lindholm returned, chuckling. Then he took the proof of an advertisement from the columns of a great New York daily and passed it over to Monmouth. "Wealthy Westerner wants to share home among hunting set of Long Island. Private house and right surroundings essential. References. O.L." And that light passed over the Englishman's eyes and was succeeded by a look of boredom. "You don't suppose, do you," he asked, "that the kind of people you want to know will admit a stranger from Wisconsin into their family?" "Why not?" the other cried, indignantly. "Isn't this a free country, and ain't I as good as any other man?" "In Wisconsin, undoubtedly. Can't speak for Westbury. By the way, can you ride?" "I could ride your head off," Lindholm bragged. "Yes?" said Monmouth softly. "Now that's very interesting. Perhaps we could arrange a little match somewhere." "Any time at all," Trent returned. He did not for a moment believe he had a chance against Monmouth, but he could afford to lose a little money to him. In fact, he was anxious for the opportunity. "You're staying here?" Monmouth demanded. Trent pushed a visiting card toward him. It was newly done. Oscar Lindholm, Spartan Athletic Club, Madison, Wisconsin. "Yes, I'm staying here," he admitted. "Are you?" "My home is in Westbury," Captain Monmouth replied. "Then you could get me right into the set I want." "Impossible," cried the other, rising stiffly to his feet. "One owes too much to one's friends." "Bull," said Oscar Lindholm rudely. "You only owe yourself anything. If I have a lot of money and you want some of it, why consult your friends? What have they done for you?" "I don't care to discuss it," Captain Monmouth exclaimed. "Good night, Mr. Lindholm." He limped away. Assuredly he was no simpleton. He was not sure of this blond lover of cross-country sport. If Lindholm were genuine in his desire to break into the sort of society he aimed at, he would come back to the attack. If he were not genuine, it were wiser to shake him off. As for Trent, he felt reasonably sure things would come his way. But there was a certain subtlety about these foreign gentlemen of fortune which called for careful treading. Were he once to win his way to the establishment of Madame de Beaulieu, he would be in dangerous company. The man who had just left him was dangerous, he sensed. The Countess already commanded his respect. Then there was the so-called secretary and the woman who posed now as a maid. And in the house there might be a treasure trove that would make his wildest expenditures justified. Looked at in a cool and reasonable manner, it was a very dangerous experiment for Anthony Trent to make. He would be one against four. One man against a gang of international crooks, all the more deadly because they were suave and polished. It was while he was breakfasting that Captain Monmouth took a seat near him. Trent commanded his waiter to transport his food to Monmouth's table. "What about that horse race?" he demanded. "Let me see," the other murmured. "Oh yes, you say you can ride?" "I can trim you up in good style," Trent said cheerfully. "Any old time." "What stakes?" Monmouth asked without eagerness. "What distance? Over the sticks or on the flat?" "Stakes?" Trent said as though not understanding. "I never ride or play cards for love," Monmouth told him. "That can be arranged later," Trent said. "The main thing is, where can we pull it off? Out west there's a million places, but here everything is private property." Captain Monmouth reflected for a moment. "I shall be in town again in 3 days' time. You'll be here?" "Depends what answers I get to my advertisement." "Oh yes," Monmouth returned. "They will be very amusing. Very amusing indeed." "Why?" Trent demanded. "Because the people who will answer will not suit your purpose at all. There may be many who will be glad of help in running a house in these hard times. but they dare not answer an advertisement like yours for fear it might be known. And then again, think of the risk of taking an unknown into the home." "I offer references," Trent reminded him. "But my dear sir," Monmouth protested, "what are athletic clubs in Madison to do with those who have the entree to Meadowbrook?" "Supposing," Trent said presently, "a family such as I want did get into communication with me, how much would they expect?" Captain Monmouth looked at him appraisingly. Trent felt certain that if a figure were named it would be the one he would have to pay for the privilege of meeting the charming Madame de Beaulieu. "One couldn't stay at a decent hotel under $250 a week," the cavalryman returned. "You'd have to pay at least $500." "That's a lot," Trent commented. "I imagined you'd think that," Monmouth said dryly. "But I could pay it easy enough," the pseudo-Scandinavian retorted. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 26. Anthony Trent, Paying Guest. And in the end he did. When Captain Monmouth suggested that the match between the two be ridden off on his own grounds near Westbury, Anthony Trent felt certain that he was taken there to be inspected by the other members of the household. Edward Conway was a taciturn, drink-sodden man not inclined to be friendly with the affable Oscar Lindholm. Of the match little need be said. Trent, a good rider, had engaged to beat a professional at his own game. Captain Monmouth was the richer by $1,000. In the billiard room of Elm Lodge after the race, Monmouth offered his guest some excellent Scotch whisky and grew a little more amiable. "I presume, Mr. Lindholm," he said, "that you would have no objection to my man of business looking up your rating in Madison." "Go as far as you like. What you will find will be satisfactory." "It is," Monmouth smiled. "I wish I'd half the money that you have. I should consider myself rich enough, and God knows my tastes are not simple." "So you had me investigated?" Trent smiled a little. "When?" "When we made this match." Trent had found that the assumption of a name might be dangerous if investigations were made concerning it. It was with his customary caution that he had taken Lindholm's name. David Moore, his little detective, often spoke of his cases to his patron. He had spoken at length about the case of Oscar Lindholm of Madison, Wisconsin. A lumber millionaire, Oscar came to New York to have a good time in the traditional manner of wealthy men from far states. A joyride in which a man was run down figured prominently in his first night's entertainment. Fearing that the notoriety of this would affect his political aspirations in the West, he was sentenced to a month on Blackwell's Island under an assumed name. During this month his name could safely be used. The day that Trent became a member of the household at Elm Lodge, the real Lindholm had 10 days more to serve. The wardrobe which Trent had gathered about him was utterly unlike his own perfect outfit. He conceived Oscar Lindholm to be without refinements and he dressed the part. He could see Captain Monmouth shudder as he came into the drawing room on the night of his arrival. Lindholm wore a Prince Albert coat and wore it aggressively. His patent leather shoes had those hideous knobs on them wherein a dozen toes might hide themselves. "My dear man," gasped Monmouth, "we dress for dinner always." "What's the matter with me?" the indignant guest asked. "Everything," Monmouth cried. "You look like an undertaker. Fortunately we're very much of a size and I have some dress clothes I've never worn. If Madame de Beaulieu had seen you I don't know what would have happened." In 10 minutes Trent was back in the drawing room, this time arrayed as he himself desired to be. Madame de Beaulieu had not yet come down. "Madame is particular then?" Trent hazarded. "She has a right to be," Monmouth said a little stiffly. "She belongs to one of the great families of France." Trent, watching him, saw that he believed it. This was a new angle. She had deceived Monmouth without a doubt. For the first time and the last Trent observed a certain confusion about Captain Monmouth. "In confidence," he said, "Madame de Beaulieu and I are engaged to be married. Captain de Beaulieu and she were negotiating for divorce when the war broke out, and we must wait therefore." Trent, remembering Moore's report as to the members of the household, pointed to Edward Conway sipping his third cocktail. "That's the chaperone, eh?" "Madame de Beaulieu's aunt, Madame de Berlaymont, is here," Monmouth said affably. "It is our custom to use French at the table as much to starve the servants of food for gossip as anything else. You speak French, of course?" "Not a word," Trent lied promptly. "Now if you want to talk Danish or Swedish I'm with you." Madame de Berlaymont? No doubt the French maid resuming the aunt pose. At the Guestwick affair she had been an English lady of fashion. Had they put themselves to this bother simply for his sake? He doubted it. "We've not been here long," Captain Monmouth went on, "and we know very few people. Of course we could easily know the wrong sort, but that's dangerous. Tonight one of the most popular and influential men in the country is coming." Captain Monmouth had no time to mention his name, for Madame de Beaulieu came in. It was the first time Trent had met her face to face since that night at the Guestwicks. He was not without a certain nervousness. Looking at himself in the mirror he seemed so much the product of peroxide that it must easily be recognized. But Madame de Beaulieu gave him the most cursory of glances. There was a certain nervousness about her and Monmouth which had little enough to do with him. This visit of the influential neighbor plainly was what concerned them. Trent assumed, shrewdly enough, that they were trying, for reasons of their own, to break into the wealthy hunting set and had not found it easy. Madame de Beaulieu was beautifully gowned. She looked to be a woman of 30, whereas when he had first seen her she looked no more than 22. She carried herself splendidly. Her French accent was marked. In the police court she spoke as the English do. When the little bent, grey ringleted but distinguished aunt came in he could not recognize her at all. Assuredly he had stumbled upon as high class a band of crooks as had ever bothered police. He could sense that they regarded him as a necessary nuisance whose $500 a week helped the household expenses. And he knew, instinctively, that Captain Monmouth and Edward Conway would plan to get some of the millions he was supposed to have. Trent's Swedish accent was copied faithfully from his janitor, who had been of a superior class in his own country before he had fallen to furnace tending. He did not overdo it. To those listening he appeared anxious to overcome his accent and lapsed into it only occasionally. Trent heard Monmouth tell Madame de Beaulieu that Lindholm's dress was terrible and that by God's grace their measurements were identical or they would have been disgraced by a guest in a frock coat. He spoke in rapid French and in an undertone, but Trent's ears were sharp and had ere this warned him of danger where another man would have heard nothing. The guest of honor was no less than Conington Warren. He was ripely affable. He had come to this dinner more to report on the behavior of the strangers occupying Elm Lodge than anything else. A bachelor may sit at a table, or a divorced man, where the married man cannot go. At the Mineola show Madame de Beaulieu had made a good impression on the women, but they were not sure of her. They had found that Captain Monmouth was indeed the second son of Sir John Monmouth, Bart, and formerly an officer of Lancers. He had wasted his money at the racetrack and the gaming table. But then that was not wholly frowned upon by the young bloods of American society. Trent could see that Warren was impressed. There was an air of breeding about his hostess and host he had not thought to see. The dinner was good enough to win his distinguished commendation. He unbent so far as to question Mr. Lindholm about political conditions in his native state. He congratulated Madame de Beaulieu on the single string of exquisite pearls that were about her white throat. And well he might. Cartier had charged Peter Chalmers Rosewarne a pretty penny for them not so long ago. Had he but known it, he would have been even more interested in the ring which Oscar Lindholm wore. It was a plain gold band in which a single ruby blazed. He had never worn it till now. he felt Lindholm might easily allow himself the luxuries of which Anthony Trent was denied. The stone had adorned a stick pin which Conington Warren once loved and lost. Monmouth's knowledge of horses commended itself to the owner of thoroughbreds. Two men such as these could not play a part where horses were concerned. Conington Warren remembered seeing Monmouth win that greatest of all steeplechases, the Grand National. A camaraderie was instantly established. It was a triumphant night. Undoubtedly the household at Elm Lodge would be accepted. Thinking over the situation in his own room that night, Trent admitted he was puzzled. Why this struggle for social recognition? His first theory, that it was in order to rob wealthy homes, was dismissed as untenable. To begin with, it was an old trick and played out. Directly an alien household in a colony of old friends attracts attention, it also attracts suspicion. And if this section of Westbury were to suffer an epidemic of burglaries, Madame de Beaulieu's home would come under police supervision. There was little doubt in Trent's mind that this Captain Monmouth was a member of the family he claimed as his. Conington Warren and he had common friends in England. What was his game? And yet Madame de Beaulieu, or the Countess, had been notorious as the leading member of a gang of high-class crooks. She had even been finger-printed and had, he believed, served a sentence. Not a month before she had taken $100,000 worth of jewels from St. Michael's Mount and an amount of currency not specified. As the days went by, Trent made other discoveries. He found for one thing that the man whose name he had taken had a reputation for drinking, for he found a decanter and siphon ever at his elbow. By degrees he and Edward Conway gravitated together. This Conway, whose part in the game he could not yet guess, was drinking himself steadily to death. One morning Trent came upon Conway scribbling on a pad of paper. He stared hard at what he wrote and then tossed the crumpled paper into a nearby open fire. The day was chilly and the blazing logs were cheerful. When Conway was gone, Trent retrieved the paper and saw the signature he had assumed copied to a nicety. Conway probably had his uses as a forger. The gang of the Countess had accomplished notable successes by these means. Trent had not been an hour in the house when he discovered that Monmouth and Madame de Beaulieu had eyes only for one another. It was a vulgar intrigue, Trent supposed, and explained the situation. But as day succeeded day, he found he was wrong. Here were two people, a beautiful woman, accomplished and fascinating, and a man of uncommon good looks and distinction, head over ears in love with one another. Conceivably such people, removed from the conventions of society, would pay small attention to the convenances, and yet he saw no gesture or heard no word in French or English that was not proper. Sometimes he felt he must have mistaken the aristocratic Madame de Beaulieu and her Empire aunt for the wrong women. But he could not mistake the rose-worn pearls which he had viewed in Cartier's only a week before the mining man bought them as a birthday present for his wife. The night that Monmouth and the woman he loved were asked to a dinner party at Conington Warren's home, Oscar Lindholm had 2 more days to serve on Blackwell's Island. So far Anthony Trent had accomplished nothing. He had lost $1,000 on a horse race, 2 weekly payments of $500 for board, and another 1,000 in small amounts at auction and pool. He was most certainly a paying guest. Conway and Trent were not asked. Madame de Berlaymont was indisposed. It was the opportunity he had wanted. It was Conway's habit to sleep from about 10 in the evening until midnight. Every night since Trent had been at Elm Lodge the so-called secretary had done so. In a large winged chair with an evening paper unopened on his knees he would fall into sleep. He could be counted upon, therefore, not to interrupt. The servants retired no later than 10 to their distant part of the rambling house. Only Madame de Berlaymont might be in the way. In reality this amiable chaperone was a woman in the early 20s, Trent believed, and could not be counted upon to remain unmoved if she heard strange noises in the night as of burglars moving. Trent already knew the layout of the house. It was just past 10 when the servants went to bed and Conway sunk in his 2-hour slumber that Oscar Lindholm went exploring. Stepping very carefully by Madame de Berlaymont's room, he listened a long while. No sound met his ears. Then, with a practiced skill, he turned the door knob and entered an unlighted room. Still there was no sound of breathing. And when he switched on the light, the apartment was empty. The indisposition which had kept the aged lady 2 days confined to her chamber was plainly a ruse. Trent could return to it later. Never before tonight had Trent carried an automatic pistol and been prepared to use it if necessary. He was now in a house whose inmates were, like himself, shrewd, resourceful and strong. For all he knew, Conway might long ago have suspected him. Madame de Beaulieu and her chaperone occupied the bedrooms of one wing of the low rambling house. In the other wing, Monmouth, Lindholm and Conway slept. Over this bachelor wing, as it was called, were some smaller rooms where the 4 maidservants slept. The rooms of Madame de Beaulieu were beautifully furnished. It was a suite with salon, bedroom and a large bathroom. Trent determined to allow himself an hour and a half. Skilled as he was in searching, he felt he would discover something in those 90 minutes. But the time had almost gone by and he was baffled. There was nothing. He probed and sounded and measured as he had seen Dangerfield's detectives do, but nothing rewarded him. What jewels Madame de Beaulieu owned she'd probably worn. But how dare she wear at a dinner party where the Rosewarnes might conceivably be, so well known a string of pearls? And what of those other baubles which were missing from St. Michael's home? A carved ivory jewel box on her dressing table revealed only a ball the size of a golf ball made of silver paper. She had begged him to save the tinsel and the boxes of cigarettes he smoked so that she might bind this mass until it became worthy of sending to the Red Cross. Anthony Trent balanced the silver sphere in his hand. Naturally it was heavy. If I, he mused, wanted to hide my 3 beauties, I couldn't think of anything safer than this. She's clever too. Why shouldn't she use it for something she's afraid of anybody seeing? A steel hatpin was to his hand. Exerting a deal of wrist strength, he thrust it through the mass. In the middle it met with a resistance that the pin could not pierce. It was 12 o'clock as he put it in his pocket and locked the door of his own room. It seemed minutes before his eager fingers could strip off piece after piece of silver paper. And then the palm of his hand cupped one of the most beautiful diamonds he had ever seen. It was fully 100 carats in weight, and its value he could hardly approximate. No stone of this size had ever been lost in the United States. He remembered, however, some 4 years ago, the Nizam of Hyderabad, one of the greatest of Indian potentates and owner of an unparalleled collection of diamonds, had bought a famous stone in London. It was never delivered to him. The messenger had been found floating in the Thames off Greenhithe. The reputed price of purchase had been £35,000. The Nizam's had been a blue-white diamond, and Anthony Trent believed he held it in his hand. He thought of his Benares lamp and chuckled. If he desired to avenge himself on Madame de Beaulieu for the loss of the Guestwick money, he was amply rewarded now. The blazing thing in his hand would fetch at least $200,000 if he dared dispose of it. Obviously the correct procedure for the supposed Oscar Lindholm was to make his escape at once. He would have little chance to do so were the abstraction to become known. Of course Madame de Beaulieu would look in her ivory casket directly she came in. Did he himself not always glance anxiously at his lamp whenever he had been away from it for a few hours? Cautiously he made his way down to the hall where his coat and hat were. As he passed the door it opened and Madame de Beaulieu entered with Monmouth. She was pale, so pale indeed that Trent stopped to look at her. "Back early, aren't you?" he asked. "Madame has had bad news," said Monmouth, and looked at her anxiously. She sank into a big chair before the open fire. Certainly she was very beautiful. Looking at her it seemed incredible that she could be one of the best known adventuresses in the world. Perhaps, after all, much of the anecdote that was built about her was legendary. Presently she spoke in French to Monmouth. "Bear with me, my dear one," she said, "but I must see him alone. I am a creature of premonitions. Let me have my way." The look that Captain Monmouth bent upon Anthony Trent was not a friendly one. There was a new quality of suspicion and antagonism in it. "Madame de Beaulieu," he said stiffly, "wants to speak with you alone. I see no occasion for it, but her wish is law. I shall leave you here." When they were alone she did not speak for some minutes. Then she turned to him and looked at him searchingly. He felt the necessity of being on his guard. "Mr. Lindholm," she said quietly, "I do not understand you." "Why should you bother to?" he asked. "Because I am afraid of everything I do not trust. You say you are a naturalized Swede. That would explain your hair." She leaned forward and looked him full in the face. "Mr. Lindholm, you have made one very silly mistake which no woman would make." "And that is what?" he demanded. "You have let your bleached hair get black at the roots. You are a black-haired man. Why deny it?" "I don't," he said. "I admit it." "Then why are you here?" "Captain Monmouth knows. A desire to break into society, if you like." "Will you answer me one question truthfully?" she asked. "On your honor?" "Yes," he said. There was no reason why he should not. "Are you a detective?" "On my honor, no. Why should Madame de Beaulieu fear detectives?" There was a faint flush in her cheeks now and a brighter color in her eyes. She was enormously relieved at his answer. "Why are you here then?" "If you must know," he told her, "it was for revenge." "Not to harm Captain Monmouth?" she cried, paling. "I came on your account," he said quietly. "You don't remember me?" She shook her head. "When did we meet? In Europe?" "No less a place than Fifth Avenue." "Ah, at some social function. One meets so many that one has no time for recalling names or even faces." "Later I saw you at a police court. You were an indignant young Englishwoman accused of robbing Mr. Guestwick, or trying to. You may recall a man who opened the Guestwick safe for you, a man upon whose good nature you imposed." He looked very somber and stern. She shrank back and covered her face with her white hands. "I knew happiness was not for me," she said brokenly. "I said, when I found the man I loved was the man who loved me, 'It is too wonderful, too beautiful. It is not for me. I am born under an unlucky star.' And you see I was right." Trent considered her for a moment. Here was no acting. Here was a woman whose soul was in agony. "You forget," he said, "that I don't know what you mean." "I'd better tell you," she said with a gesture of despair. "Captain Monmouth and I love each other. It has awakened the good in us that we both thought was buried or had never existed. While my husband, Captain de Beaulieu, lived there was no chance of a divorce. He is Catholic. Tonight after dinner one of Mr. Warren's guests brought a late paper from New York and I saw that my husband was killed. I could stay there no longer. Coming home in the motor I asked myself whether it would be my fate to win happiness. I doubted it even though I repented in ashes. Then it was I began to think of you, the stranger whose money we needed, the stranger who reminded me vaguely of some day when there was danger in the air. Under the light as I came in I saw your hair. Then I knew that in the hour of my greatest hope I was to experience the most bitter despair." "You forget, madame," he said harshly, "that I have had the benefit of your consummate acting before." "And you think I am acting now?" "Why shouldn't I?" he retorted. "You have everything to gain by it. I can collect the Guestwick reward and send you back to prison." "I can pay you more than the $10,000 he offered," she cried quickly. "With the sale of the Rosewarne jewels?" She shrank back. "Ciel! How could you know?" "I do," he said brusquely, "and that's enough. You see you're trying to fool me again. You say your love has brought out the good in you that you didn't know you possessed, and yet a few weeks back you are at your old tricks again. Is that reasonable?" "I'll tell you everything," she cried wildly. "You must understand. It was I who took the Rosewarne jewels. Why? Because I'm fighting for my happiness. Captain Monmouth knows nothing of what my life has been. I've told him that after the war I shall go back to France and sell my property and with it help him to buy a place that was once a seat of his family. There, away from the world, we shall live and die. I want only him and he wants only me. We have known life and its vanities. We want happiness. You hold it in your hands. If you take your revenge by telling him, you break my heart. Is that a vengeance which satisfies you, Monsieur l'Inconnu? If so, it is very easy. He is in the next room. Call him. You have only to say, 'Captain Monmouth, this woman whom you love is a notorious criminal. All Europe knows her as the Countess. The money that she wants to build her house of love with is stolen money. She will assuredly disgrace your name as she has that of the great family from which she sprang.'" She looked supplicatingly at Anthony Trent. "You have only to tell him that and there is no happiness left for me in all the world." "Do you think I would do that?" he demanded. "How can I tell? Why should you not? I am in your power." There was no doubting the genuineness of her emotion. Formerly she had tricked him, but here was her bared soul to see. "I came here," he said slowly, "angry because you had played upon my sympathies and outwitted me. I schemed to gain an entrance to this house for no other reason. I shall leave it admiring you and Monmouth and hoping you will be happy." It was as though she could scarcely believe him. "Then you will not tell him?" she exclaimed. "You will go without that for which you came?" She did not understand his smile. "I shall not tell him," Anthony Trent declared. "As for the rest, we are quits, madame." At the hour when the real Oscar Lindholm left Blackwell's Island, the pretender was lovingly setting the fourth jewel in the Benares lamp. It would have been difficult to find two happier men in all America that morning. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. Mrs. Kinney makes a confession. Anthony Trent looked about his well-furnished rooms with a certain merited affection. In a week he would know them no more. Already arrangements had been made to send the furniture to his camp on Kennebago. A great deal of the furniture Weems had gathered there was distressfully bad. Weems ran to gilt and brocade mainly. As Trent surveyed his apartment, it amused him to think that never was a flat in a house such as this furnished so well and at so great a cost. The things might seem modest enough at first glance. There was, for example, a steel engraving, after Stuart, of George Washington. A fitting and a worthy picture for any American's room, but hardly one which required a large amount of money to obtain. None save Anthony Trent knew that behind the print was concealed one of the most beautiful examples of that flower of the Venetian Renaissance, Giorgione. A few months before, the Scribblers' Club had invited motion picture magnates to its monthly dinner. Only a few of these moulders of public taste had accepted. There were good enough reasons for declination. The subject incensed those who held that writers had no grudge against the movies. Others lacked speech-making ability in the English tongue. And there were some high-stomached producers who feared the Scribblers' fare might be unworthy. One big man consented to speak. He was glib with that oratory which comes from successful selling. Before he had sprung into notoriety he had been a salesman in a Seventh Avenue store, one of those persuasive gentlemen who waylay passers-by. His speech was, of course, absurd. It was interesting mainly as an example that intelligence is not always necessary in the making of big money. It was when he began to speak of the material rewards that his acumen had garnered that Anthony Trent awoke to interest. The producer told his hearers that they had assuredly read of the sale to an unnamed purchaser of a Giorgione. "I am that purchaser," said the great man. "I give more money for it than—" His shrewd appraising eye went around the table. He saw eager unsuccessful writers, starveling associate editors and a motley company of the unarrived. There were a few who had gained recognition, but in the main it was not a prosperous gathering as commerce reckons success. "I give more money for it," he declared, "than all this bunch will make in their lifetime. It'll be on view at the Metropolitan Museum next week when you boys can take an eyeful. It's on my desk at this present moment in a plain wooden case. It ain't the big picture. This Giorgione," his G was wrongly pronounced, "didn't paint 'em big. My wife don't know anything about it, but she's got the art bug and she'll get it tomorrow morning as her birthday present." However, the lady was disappointed. The wooden case was brought to the table and the magnate unwrapped it with his own fat fingers. Instead of the canvas representing a Venetian fête and undraped ladies was the comic sheet of a Sunday paper. The motion picture magnate used his weekly news sheet, produced in innumerable theaters, to advertise his loss by a production of the missing picture. It was good advertising and made the Venetian master widely known, but it still reposed behind the sphinx-like Washington. The Benares lamp was naturally his pièce de résistance. Never in history had such value been gathered together in a lamp. Trent remembered seeing once in the British Museum a lamp from the Mosque of Omar at Jerusalem on which was inscribed, "The painter is the poor and humble Mustafa." As he looked at his own lantern he thought, "The decorator is the unknown Anthony Trent." Collectors of china would have sneered at a single vase on the top of a bookcase. It was white enameled and had a few flowers painted on it, and the inscription told the curious that it was a souvenir of Watch Hill, R.I. In reality it was the celebrated vase of King Senwosri, who had gazed on it 25 centuries before Christ. Senator Scrivener had bought it at a great price in Cairo. Some day the white enamel which Trent had painted over the imperishable glass would be carefully removed and it would gladden his eyes in Maine where visitors would be infrequent. There were a dozen curious things Trent looked at, things hidden from all eyes but his, which aroused exciting memories of a career he fully believed had drawn to a close. He doubted if ever a man in all the history of crime had taken what he had taken and was yet personally unknown. Some day, if possible, he might be able to learn from the police what mental estimate they had formed of him. He must loom large in their eyes. They must invest him with a skill and courage that would be flattering indeed were he to learn of it. The occasional mentions of him he read in daily papers were too distorted to be interesting, and McWalsh's tribute to the unknown master was his only reward so far. The life that was coming was to be the life he desired. Leisure, the possession of books, the opportunity to wander as he chose through far countries when the war was over. And he liked to think that later he might find love. Often he had envied men with children. Well, he could offer the woman that he might find comforts that fiction would never have brought him. He was getting to have fewer qualms of conscience now. He often assured himself that he was honest by comparison with war profiteers. He had taken from the rich and had not withheld from the poor. His immunity from arrest, the growing certainty that his cleverness had saved him from detection, led him on this particular night to speculate upon his new life with an easy mind. He had been wise to avoid the dangers of friendship. He had been astute in selecting a woman like Mrs. Kinney, who distrusted strangers. She believed in him absolutely. She looked to his comforts and cared for his health admirably. She would assuredly be happy in Maine. And then he remembered that during the last week or so she had been strangely moody. She had sighed frequently. She had looked at him constantly and gazed away when he met her eye. She was old, and the old were fanciful, as he knew. Perhaps, after all, she regretted leaving the New York which filled her with exquisite tremblings and fear. In Maine she would be lonely. She should have a younger woman to aid her with the housework. A physician should look her over. Trent was genuinely fond of the old woman. He was thinking of her when she came into the room. Undoubtedly there was something unusual about her. There was no longer the pleasant smile on her face. He was almost certain she wore a look of fear. Instantly he sensed some danger impending. "There's a man been here 3 times today," she began. "What of it?" he demanded. So far as she could judge, the news did not disconcert him. "Is there anybody you might want to avoid?" she asked, and did not look at him as she spoke. "1,000," he smiled. "Who was it?" "He wouldn't leave his name." "What was he like?" "A man," she told him. 60. Well dressed and polite, but I didn't trust him. He'll be back at 10. It was now almost 9:30. "I don't see everybody who calls," he reminded her. "You must see him," she said seriously. "Why?" he demanded. "He said you would regret it if you did not." "Probably an enterprising salesman," he returned with an appearance almost of boredom. "No, he isn't," she said quickly. There was no doubt that Mrs. Kinney was terribly in earnest. He affected the air of composure he did not feel. "Who then?" Anthony Trent demanded. "I think it's the police," she whispered. Then suddenly she fell to weeping. "Oh, Mr. Trent," she said brokenly, "I know." "What?" he cried sharply, suddenly alert to danger, turned in that moment from the debonair, careless idler to one in imminent risk of capture. "About you," she said. "What about me?" he exclaimed impatiently. "I know how you make your living. I didn't spy on you, sir, believe me. I just happened on it." Timidly she looked over to the Benares lamp gracefully swinging in its dim corner. "I know about that." For a moment Anthony Trent said nothing. A few minutes ago he had sat in the same chair as he now occupied, congratulating himself on a new life that seemed so near and so desirable. Now he was learning that the little shrinking woman who so violently denounced crime and criminals had found him out. What compromise could he effect with her? Was it likely that she was instrumental in denouncing him to the authorities, tempted perhaps by the rewards his capture would bring? For the moment it was useless to ask how she had discovered the lamp's secret. "What are you going to do?" he demanded. He was assuredly not going to wait for the police to arrest him if escape were possible. He might have to shut the old woman in a closet and make his hurried exit. He always had a large sum of money about him. Of late the banks had been aiding the government by disclosing the names of those depositors who invested sums of a size that seemed incompatible with their positions and ways of living. He feared to make such deposits that might lead to investigation, and of late had secreted what money his professional gains had brought him. "What am I going to do?" she echoed. "Why, help you if I can." He looked at her, suspicion in his gaze. Her manner convinced him that by some means or other she had indeed stumbled upon what he had hoped was hidden. It was not a moment to ask her by what means she had done so. And equally it was no moment for denial. "Why should you help me?" he demanded. He could not afford blindly to trust anyone. "If you think you have found something irregular about me, why do you offer aid? In effect you've accused me of being a criminal. Don't you know there's a law against helping one?" "I'm one too," she said to his amazement. "Nonsense," he snapped. He was too keen a judge of character to believe that this meek old creature had fallen into evil ways. "Do you remember," she said steadily, and he could see she was intensely nervous, "that I told you I had no children when I applied for this place?" "Yes, yes," he answered impatiently. It seemed so trivial a matter now. "Well, I lied," she returned. "I had a daughter at the point of death. I needed the position and I heard you telling other applicants you wanted someone with no ties." "That's hardly criminal," Anthony Trent declared. "Wait," she wailed, "I did worse. You remember when you furnished this place you sent me to pay for some rugs. Nearly $200 it was." "And you had your pocket picked. I remember." "I took the money," she confessed. "If I had not My girl would have been buried with the nameless dead." He looked at the sobbing woman kindly. "Don't worry about that, Mrs. Kinney. If only you had told me you could have had it." "I know that now," she returned. "But then I was afraid." "You'll stand by me, notwithstanding that?" He pointed to the jeweled lamp. "Why, of course," she said simply, and he knew she was genuine. Almost as she spoke the bell rang. "Go to the head of the stairs," he commanded, "and I will let him in. Be certain to see how many there are. If there are 2 or more, call out that some men are coming. If it is the one who called before, say, 'The gentleman is here.' Listen carefully. If there are 2 or more, I shall get out by the roof. Meet me tomorrow by Grant's tomb at 10 o'clock in the morning. You've got that?" Mrs. Kinney was perfectly calm now, and he was certain that her loyalty could be depended upon. Presently she called out, "The gentleman is here." Anthony Trent rose slowly from his chair by the window as his visitor entered. It was a heavily built man of 60 or so, dressed very well. At a glance the stranger displayed distinguished urbanity. "What a charming retreat you have here, Mr. Trent," he observed. "It is convenient," said Anthony Trent shortly. The word retreat sounded unpleasantly in his ear. It had a sound of enforced seclusion. He continued to study the elder man. There was an inflection in his voice which we were pleased to term an English accent, and yet he did not seem, somehow, to be an Englishman. His accent reminded Trent of a man he had met casually 2 years before. It was at a park riding school where he kept a saddle horse that he encountered him. From his accent he believed him to be English and was surprised when he was informed that it was Captain von Papen he had taken to be British. He learned afterwards that the Germans of good birth generally learned their English among England's upper classes and acquired thereby that inflection which does not suit the average American. This stranger had just such a speaking voice. Obviously then he was German and one highly connected. And at a day when German plots and intrigue engaged public attention, what was he doing here? "Mine is a business call," said the stranger. "You do not ask if this is a convenient hour," Trent reminded him. "My dear sir," the other said smiling, "you must understand that it is a matter in which my convenience is to be consulted rather than yours." The eyes that gleamed through the thick glasses were fixed on Trent's face with a trace of amusement in them. The stranger had the look of one who holds the whip hand over another. "I don't admit that," Anthony Trent retorted. "I don't know your name or your errand and I'm not sure that I want to." "Wait," said the other. "As for my name, let it be Kaufman. As for my errand, let us say I am interested in a history of crime and want you to be a collaborator." "What qualifications have I for such an honor?" Anthony Trent rammed his pipe full of hanky and lit it with a hand that did not tremble. Instinctively he knew the other watched for signs of nervousness. "You have written remarkable stories of crime," Mr. Kaufman reminded him. "I regret that the death of an Australian uncle permitted you to retire." "You will not think it rude, I hope," Trent said with a show of politeness, "if I say that you seem to be much more interested in my business than I am in yours." "I admire your national trait of frankness," Kaufman smiled, "and will copy it. I am a merchant of Zurich, at Bahnhof Street, the largest dyer of silk in Switzerland. This much you may find through your State Department if you choose." "And owing to lack of business have taken up a study of crime?" Trent commented. "Your frankness impresses me favorably, Mr. Kaufman. I still do not see why you visit me at this hour." "We shall make it plain," Mr. Kaufman assured him cordially. "First let me tell you that my business is in danger. This dye situation is likely to ruin me. I have, or had, the formulae of the dyes I used. They were my property." "German formulae!" Trent exclaimed. "Swiss," Kaufman corrected. "Bought by me and my property. They have been stolen from my partner by an officious amateur detective, one of your allies, and brought here. The ship should be in shortly. He will stay in New York a day or so before going to Washington. When he goes he will take with him my property, my dye formulae. He will enrich American dyers at my expense." "You can't expect me to feel grieved about that," Anthony Trent said bluntly. "I do not," said Kaufman. "But I must have those formulae." He leaned forward and touched Trent on the arm. "You must get them." Trent knocked the grey ashes from his pipe. The merchant of Zurich gazed into a face which wore amusement only. He was not to know the dismay into which his covert threat had thrown the younger man. Without doubt, Trent told himself, this stranger must have stumbled upon something which made this odd visit a logical one, some discovery which would be a sword over his head. "In your own country," said Trent politely, "I have no doubt you pass for a wit. To me your humor seems strained." Kaufman smiled urbanely. "I had hoped," he asserted, "that you would not have compelled me to say again that you must get them. I fancied perhaps that you would be sensitive to any mention of, shall we say, your past." "My past?" queried Trent blandly. He did not propose to be bluffed. Too often he had played that game himself. It might still be that this man, a German without question, had only guessed at his avocation and hoped to frighten him. "Your past," repeated the merchant. "The phrase has possibly too vague a sound for you. Let me say rather your professional activities." "I see," Trent smiled. "You are interested in the writing of stories. My profession is that of a fiction writer." "You fence well," Kaufman admitted, "but I have a longer and sharper foil. I can wound you and receive never a scratch in return. You speak of fiction. Permit me to offer you a plot. Although a Swiss I have, or had, many German friends. We are still neutral, we of Switzerland, and you cannot expect us to feel the enmities this war has stirred up as keenly as you and your allies do." "That I have noticed," Trent declared. "Very well then. I have a close friend here, one Baron von Eckstein. You have perhaps heard of him, yes?" Anthony Trent knitted his brow in thought. "Married a St. Louis heiress, didn't he?" "A very delightful lady and rich," Kaufman returned. "Charitable too and loyal. My friends are all very loyal. Did you know that she donated 10 fully equipped ambulances to this country?" "I saw it in the papers," said Anthony Trent. And for the life of him he could not help smiling. Mr. Kaufman begged permission to light a cigar. It would have been difficult to find a more urbane or genial gentleman in all Switzerland. "The Baron and Baroness von Eckstein are close friends." Since he offered no other remarks, Anthony Trent spoke. "And I am to derive a story from so slender a plot?" "That is but the beginning," Kaufman assured him. "One night the Baroness had a very valuable necklace stolen. It was worth a great deal more than was supposed. Diamonds have gone up in price. She told me about it. In my native land I had some little skill as an amateur detective. She had been to a ball and had met many strangers. At my request she mentioned those to whom she had spoken at length. Among them was your name. That means nothing. There were 20 others. Now I come to another interesting thing. Do I entertain you?" Anthony Trent simulated a yawn. He gave the appearance of one who listens because a guest in his house speaks and politeness demands it. In reality 100 schemes went racing through his head and in most of them Herr Kaufmann played a part that would have made him nervous had he guessed it. "Indeed, yes," Anthony Trent assured him. "Please continue." "Very well," said the other cheerfully. "Next my plot takes me to New Bedford. You know it?" "A mill town, I believe." "Many of the mills are owned by my friend Jerome Dangerfield who used to purchase my dyes. We are friends of 30 years. He was the owner of the celebrated Mount Aubyn ruby. It was stolen from him, knocked out of his very hands. A most mysterious case. You have heard of it?" "I saw that $10,000 was offered for the return of the stone and capture of the thief." "I made my little list of those to whom Dangerfield had talked during his stay at Sunset Park. Your name was there, Mr. Trent." "If you're thinking of writing it up," Trent said kindly, "I must advise you that editors of the better sort rather frown on coincidence. Coincidence in fiction is a shabby old gentleman today with fewer friends every year. What next?" "Nothing now," Kaufman admitted readily. "Since then I have investigated you. I find you write no more, that you live well, that while your money supposedly comes from Australia you never present an Australian draft at your bank. Now, my dear Mr. Trent, I may misjudge you. Possibly I do. But in the interests of my friends the Baron and Baroness, to say nothing of my customer Jerome Dangerfield, I may be permitted to investigate any man whose way of living seems suspicious. I ought perhaps to put the matter into the hands of the police." "Have you?" Trent demanded sharply. "Not yet. It may be that I shall when I leave here. You may be thinking what a fool I am to come here and tell you these startling things when you are so much younger and stronger than I. I should answer if you asked me that I have a permit to carry a revolver and that I have availed myself of it." Blandly he showed the other a .38 automatic Bayard pistol. "You may be misjudged," he said cordially. "If so, I offer you the apology of a Swiss gentleman. But consider my position. Suppose we abide by the decision of the police." He looked keenly at Anthony Trent. "Are you willing to leave it to them? Shall I call up Spring 3100?" Kaufman gave Trent the idea that he knew very much more about his life than he had so far admitted. There was a certainty about the man that veiled disquieting things. If he knew the Von Ecksteins and Dangerfield as he claimed, it was one of those unfortunate coincidences which life often provides to humble supercilious editors like Crosbeigh. Police investigation was a thing Trent feared greatly. Under cross-examination his defense would fall abjectly. It was no good to inquire how Kaufman had found out that he had never offered an Australian cheque at his bank. It was sufficient that his charge was true. "It is rather late to bother the police," he said smiling. Kaufman breathed relief. "Ah," he said genially, "we shall make excellent collaborators, I can see that. Today is Tuesday. On Thursday at this hour I shall come with particulars of what I expect you to do for us." "Us?" Trent exclaimed. "Myself and my partners," Kaufman explained. "Yes, at this hour I shall come and you will serve your interest by doing in all things as I say. The alternative is to telephone police headquarters and say an elderly merchant from Zurich threatens you, slanders you, impels you to perform unpleasant offices." Kaufman, smiling benignly, backed toward the door. He closed it behind him. A little later Anthony Trent saw him on the sidewalk 5 stories below. He started as he heard footsteps behind him. It was Mrs. Kinney. "Was it anything serious?" she asked. "I'm afraid it was," he answered. "I want you to go up to Kennebago with me tomorrow afternoon. I shall take only my personal baggage. The furniture can wait. The apartment will be locked up." She spoke with a certain hesitation. "I listened to what he was saying, Mr. Trent." "I hoped you would," he answered. "I may need a witness." "Don't you think it would be wiser to wait and do what he wants you to?" "Perhaps," retorted her employer, "but I don't see how he can find me out in Kennebago. Who knows about it but you and Weems? You haven't mentioned it to anyone and Weems isn't anxious his financial condition should be suspected. And beside that, he's in Los Angeles. I shall pay the rent of this flat up till Christmas and tell the agent I may be back for a few days any time. I must leave the furniture." He looked about him regretfully. That could be traced easily enough. He decided to take the Benares lamp, Stuart's picture of Washington, the vase of King Senwosri and one or two things of price. They could go in his trunks. "But sir," Mrs. Kinney persisted timidly, "if he finds you out it may go badly with you and it wouldn't be difficult to get what he wants." "Perhaps not," he said gravely, "but if I were to do one such thing for them they would use me continually." "But he only wants his dye formulae," she reminded him. "Don't you understand," he said, "that he is a German spy and wants me to betray my country?" End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. Chapter 28. The German Spy Merchant. Anthony Trent rode into Kennebago by the corduroy road from Rangeley. It took longer, but it seemed a less likely way of being seen than if he had taken the train to Kennebago. It had been his intention, before Kaufman had come across his horizon, to make the call upon Mr. Westward his first action. As he stood at the window of the big dining room he could see the genial angler, and John his guide, rowing over to the edge of a favorite pool. There he sat in the stern, rod in hand, no doubt thinking of the chapter he was writing on the psychology of trout. For years Anthony Trent had looked forward to days like this in his new home. But the thrill of it was gone. He had hoped to look over the lake to the purple hills beyond with a serenity of mind that might now never be his. How much did Kaufman know? Would he lodge information with the police? Dare he? Probably he would not dare to call. But anonymous information of so important a character would speedily bring detectives on his trail. Beyond a question he should have bought a camp on some far Canadian lake under another name and reached it by devious ways. He had betrayed much ingenuity in bringing himself, Mrs. Kinney and their baggage to Kennebago as it was. Successions of taxis from hotel to station and from station to hotel, crossing his own tracks a half dozen times would make pursuit difficult. He had no way of estimating Kaufman's skill at following a clue. But the man had impressed him, Anthony Trent, who had foiled so many. Next morning he determined to fish and was attending to his rods with the loving care of the conscientious angler when a knock came at the door. It opened onto the big screened piazza. "Come in," he shouted, thinking Mrs. Kinney wished to consult him. Instead there entered Mr. Westward, who greeted him heartily. It was indeed an honor, for the piscatorial expert called upon few. "Glad to see you, my dear fellow," said Westward, shaking him by the hand. "I happened to meet a friend of yours who was coming to see you and lost his way, so I've brought him along." Kaufman also wrung his hand. He seemed no less delighted to see Trent than at Mr. Westward. "What a charming retreat you have here," he exclaimed cordially. There followed a conversation concerning trout and salmon which under normal conditions would have been delightful to Trent. Kaufman was affable, genial and talked of the finny spoils of his native lakes. It was only when Westward's erect form had disappeared down the path that his manner became forbidding. "Why did you leave New York?" he snapped. "Because I chose to," said the other. "What a fool! What a fool!" cried Kaufman. "And how fortunate that I am good-tempered." "Why?" Trent demanded. "Because I might have had you investigated by the police. Instead I followed you here, not without difficulty I admit, and to renew my offer." He looked about the luxurious house that was miscalled a camp. It was not the kind of home a man would lose willingly. "I ask very little. I only want a certain package of letters which a man who lands tomorrow in New York has in his possession. One so skilled as you can get it easily. You have presence, education, ready wit. I confess it is difficult for me to believe you have sunk so low." Anthony Trent flushed angrily. "There are lower depths yet," he exclaimed. "Yes," the other returned. "As for instance?" "Your sort of work," he cried. "Do you suppose I imagine you to be a Swiss silk merchant of Bahnhof Street?" Kaufmann threw back his head and laughed. "My passport, recently vised by your State Department, is made out to Adolf Kaufmann of Zurich. I have Swiss friends in New York and Chicago who will identify me." "Naturally," said Trent. Simple precautions of that sort would have to be taken. That's elementary."
"Let us get back to business," said the other. "I want those papers. Will you get them for me? Think it over well. You may say you will not. You may say you prefer to remain here in this delightful place and catch trout. Let us suppose that you say you defy me. What happens? You lose all chance to look at trout for 10, 15, 20 years, accordingly as the judge regards your offences. I've mentioned only 2 crimes to you. Of these I have data and I'm certain. There are 2 others in which I can interest myself if necessary. I do not wish to bother myself with you after you do as I command. Get me the papers and you may remain here till you have grandchildren of marriageable age. Is it worth defying me, Mr. Trent?"
The younger man groaned as he thought it over. The fabric he had made so carefully was ready to fall apart. Kaufman went on talking.
"The man you must follow is called Commander Godfrey Heathcote, of the British Navy. On his breast he wears the ribbons of the Victoria Cross, a blue one for the Navy, and the red ribbon, edged with blue, of the Distinguished Service Order. He is a man much of your build, but has straw-colored hair and light blue eyes. He walks with a limp owing to a wound received at the Zeebrugge affair. He is supposed to be over here to stay with relatives who have a place on the James River. He leaves for Washington soon, where his business is with the Secretary of the Navy. The papers I want are in a pigskin cigarette case, old and worn. You'd better bring the case in its entirety."
Kaufman rattled off his instructions in a sure and certain manner. Evidently he had no fear of being denied. "Isn't it unusual for an English naval commander to carry trade secrets about with him?" Trent demanded.
"Why keep up the farce?" Kaufman exclaimed. "You too are a man of the world. You realize you are in my power and must do as you are bid."
"Must I?" Trent answered with a frown. "I am asked to play the traitor to my country and you expect me to accept without hesitation."
"Why not?"
Kaufman returned. "Would you be the first that fear of exposure has led into such ways? If I were to tell you how we—" he paused a moment and then smiled. "How we silk merchants of Switzerland have used our knowledge of the black pages of men's lives or the indiscretions of well-known women, you would understand more readily how we obtain what we want." "I understand," said Anthony Trent gloomily. He was a case in point.
"And you will save yourself?"
"I don't know," said Trent hesitating. But he knew that Kaufman had made such threats as these to others and had gained his desires. "What's in those papers?"
"Die formulae," smiled the elder man.
Anthony Trent looked at him angrily. His nerves were on edge. Plainly Kaufman felt it unwise to stir the smoldering passion in him.
"England," he informed the other, "has recently reorganized the mine fields outside Sheerness at the mouth of the Thames. Commander Heathcote, who is here ostensibly to recuperate from wounds, is chosen to carry the plans to the Navy Department. There you have all I know."
"But that's treachery," Trent cried.
"What's England to you?" Kaufman answered. "Or you to England? I'm not asking you to take American plans."
"It's the same thing now," Trent persisted. "We're allies and what's treachery to one is treachery to the other."
"Admirable," Kaufman sneered. "Admirable. But I invite you to come down to Mother Earth. You are not concerned with the affairs of nations. You are concerned only with your own safety, which is the nearer task. You get those plans or you go to prison. You realize my power. I need you. You may ask why I've gone to this trouble to take you, a stranger, more or less into my confidence. Very well. I shall tell you. My own men are working like slaves in your accursed internment camps and I am alone who had so many to command."
"Alone?" said Anthony Trent in an altered voice and looked at him oddly. Kaufman observed the look and laughed. "I'm a mind reader," he said cheerfully. "I will tell you what is passing through your brain. You are wondering whether if those strong hands of yours get a grip of my throat your own troubles too would not be at an end. No, my friend, I still have my Bayard with me. And why run the risk, if you should overpower me, of being tried for murder? What I ask of you is very little. Remember also
that I have but to say the word and you land in prison." "You'd go with me?" Trent exclaimed. "I think not," smiled Kaufman. "Jerome Dangerfield and others would vouch for me, whereas I fear you would be friendless. And even if I were interned, how would that help you? Be sensible and get ready to accompany me to New York on the 5 o'clock train. I have your reservations." It was not easy to explain things to Mrs. Kinney. Trent told her that his suspicions of Kaufman's German sympathies were wrong. He said he was compelled to get the dye formulae and would return within a few days. "I shall come too," Mrs. Kinney observed. "I left a lot of my things at the flat and I shall need them." It seemed to Trent that she was not deceived by his words, and while he would have preferred to leave her in Maine, he could think of no reason for keeping her there if she wished to leave. All the way he was gloomy. To Kaufmann's sallies he made morose answers. Presently the so-called Swiss left him alone. But Trent could not escape the feeling that his every action was watched. He was to all intents and purposes bond servant to an enemy of his country. "Just a final word," said Kaufman as they neared the 125th Street station. "What else?" Trent said impatiently. He was filled with disgust with himself and of hatred for the German. "Remember that the cigarette case which holds my formulae is a long flat one holding 12 cigarettes. On it is stamped G.H. He does not secrete it as you think, but exposes it carelessly to view. I advise you to go straight to your apartment and await my letter. It is necessary for me to find out particulars which it might be unwise for you to do. I don't want you to fall under suspicion." "You are very thoughtful," sneered Trent. He knew well enough that he had a value in Kaufmann's eyes which would be destroyed were he to come under police supervision. That this was the only case where he was to be used was unlikely. Having used him once he would be at their command again. But would he? Anthony Trent sat back in his chair, deep lines on his drawn white face. This was the reward of the life he had led. And the way to break from Kaufmann's grip was to run the risk of the long prison term or the taking of a life. And even were he to come to this, Kaufman might be only one of a gang whose other members might command his services. "I shall send you a message by telephone if it is still in your flat. It is? Good. That simplifies matters. Wait until you receive it and then act immediately." Anthony Trent disregarded the outstretched hand and cordial smile when a minute or so later the train pulled into the Grand Central. He hailed a taxi and drove to his rooms, utterly obsessed with his bitter thoughts. It was not until he pulled up the shades and glanced about the place that he remembered Mrs. Kinney. He had forgotten her. But he relied on her common sense. Sooner or later she would come. Meanwhile he must wait for Kaufmann's telephone message. The message arrived before the woman. "Tomorrow," said Kaufman, "your friend leaves for Washington. He is staying at the Carlton and goes to his room after dinner. He will be pleased to see you. Tomorrow night I shall call upon you soon after dark." The Carlton was the newest of the hotels, the most superbly decorated, the hotel that always disappointed the nouveau riche because so little gold leaf had been used in the process. Anthony Trent had spent a night or two in every big hotel the city boasted. In a little notebook there were certain salient features carefully put down, hints which might be useful to him. Turning to the book he read it carefully. He was already acquainted with the general layout of the hotel, which had been generously explained in the architectural papers. The hotel detectives were men of whom he liked to learn as much as possible. The house detective, the head of them, was Francis Xavier Glynn, who felt himself kin to Gaboriau because of his subtle methods. He would often come to the hotel desk and register, talking in a loud tone about his Western business connections. He dressed in what he assumed was the Western manner. To his associates this seemed the height of cunning. As a matter of fact, the high-class crook who prefers the high-class hotel knew of it and was amused. Clark was Trent's informant. The old editor had pointed him out to the younger man one day when they had met near enough to the hotel's cafe entrance to go in and have a drink. As a rule Trent made elaborate plans for the successful carrying out of his work, but here he was suddenly told to engage in a very difficult operation. Disguises must be good indeed to stand the glare of hotel corridors and dining rooms.
he decided to go and trust to some plan suggesting itself when the moment arrived. He registered as Conway Parker of York, Pennsylvania, and the grip which the boy carried to his room had on it C.P. York, Pa. Trent had given a couple of dollars for it at a second-hand store. It dulled suspicions which might have been aroused were the bag and initials glaringly new. It was part of Francis Xavier Glynn's plan to have the hotel boys report hourly on any unusual happening. As Trent had waited to register, he noted the name he was looking for, Commander Heathcote, had a room on the 17th floor. Parker was assigned to one on the 7th. Directly the boy had left, Anthony Trent started to work. He found just cause of offense so far as the location of his room went. It was an inside room and the heat of the day made it oppressive. Commander Heathcote, as he found by taking a trip to the 17th floor, had an outside room. A further investigation proved that immediately over the commander's room was an unoccupied suite. To effect the exchange was not easy. Trent could not very well dictate the location of the room or betray so exact a knowledge of hotel topography without incurring suspicion. But at last the thing was done. The gentleman from York wanted a sitting room, bedroom and bath and obtained it immediately over those of the naval officer. He passed Heathcote in the dining room and looked at him keenly. The two men were of a height. Heathcote was broader. Trent instantly knew him for that fighting type characterized by the short straight nose, cleft chin and light blue eyes. It was a man to beware of in an encounter. He limped a little and walked with a cane. And while he waited for his hors d'oeuvre he took out a long pigskin cigarette case. It was within 10 feet of the man who had come to steal it. For a wild moment he wondered whether it were possible to lunge for it and make his escape. A moment later he was annoyed that such a puerile thought had visited him. It meant that his nerves were not under their usual control. After dinner 2 or 3 men spoke to the commander as he limped toward the elevator. One, a British colonel, shook hands heartily and congratulated him on the V.C. Another, a stranger evidently, tried to get him into conversation. Trent noted that the commander, although courteous to a degree, was not minded to make hotel acquaintances. He declined a drink and refused a cigar by taking out his cigarette case. The stranger looked at it curiously. "Seen some service, hasn't it?" the affable stranger remarked and took it from the owner's hand. "A very old pal," said the naval man. Trent had observed the slight hesitation before he had permitted it to leave his hand. "I wouldn't lose it for a lot." Trent stood ready. It might be that this thick-skinned stranger was after the same loot as he, but he handed it back and strolled off to the cafe where he joined a group of perfectly respectable businessmen from Columbus, O. As most travelers in first-class hotels know, the 18th story of the Carlton looks across a block of fashionable private houses on its north side. There is on that account no possibility of any prying stranger gazing into its rooms from across the way. Towering above these lesser habitations, the Carlton looms inaccessible, austere, remote. In the grip which had once belonged to the unknown C.P. of York, Pa., Anthony Trent had put the kit necessary for a short stay. There was also certain equipment without which certain nervous travelers rarely stray from home. For example, there was a small axe. In a collision at sea, many are drowned who might escape did not the impact have the effect of jamming the doors of their staterooms. The axe in the hands of the thoughtful voyager could be used to hack through thin planking to freedom. There was also a small coil of high-grade rope, tested to 300 pounds. In case of fire, the careful traveler might slide to earth. Not, of course, from an 18th floor. At 1:30 that night it was very dark and cloudy. A light rain dropped on dusty streets and there was silence. Tying his line to the firm anchorage of a pipe in the bathroom, Anthony Trent began his work. He was dressed in a dark blue suit. He wore no collar and on his hands were dark gray gloves. Below him was the green and white striped awning that protected Commander Heathcote's windows. It was almost certain that an Englishman would sleep with windows open. It was not difficult for a gymnast to slide down the rope head foremost. When Trent could touch the top of the Heathcote awning, he took a safety razor blade from his lips and cut a slit across it sufficiently wide to admit his head and shoulders. It was not a descent which caused much trouble. There was the chance that the rope might break. He wondered through how many awnings he would plunge before consciousness left him. Heathcote was asleep. By a table near the bed was an ashtray, matches, Conrad's Youth and the cigarette case, and lying near was the stout cane which the man who was wounded in that splendid attack on Zeebrugge used to aid himself in his halting walk. Trent, with the case in his pocket, walked to the door. It was not his intention to make the more hazardous climb up to his room when so easy a way of getting there presented itself. It was locked and barred. In his room he sat and looked at what he had taken. It represented, so Kaufman said, his freedom from arrest. It contained plans of vital importance to the Allies. They could only be used by the enemy to bring destruction to those who fought for right. And what punishment would be given the wounded hero for losing what was entrusted to him? For an hour Trent sat there looking at the pigskin case, and gradually what had seemed an impossible sacrifice to make came to be something desirable and splendid. Anthony Trent had never been able to regard his career as one justified by circumstances. There burned in his breast the spark of patriotism more strongly than he knew. He had fought his fight and won. His eyes were moist as he thought of his father, that old Civil War soldier who had been wounded on Gettysburg's bloody field and walked always with a limp like the English soldier beneath. When he opened the door, Heathcote was still slumbering. He replaced the case as nearly in the position he found as he could. In that moment Anthony Trent felt he could look any man in the face. He was still slumbering when Commander Heathcote awoke. Presently the officer saw that the door was unbarred and, as investigation proved, unlocked. "I'd have sworn," muttered the commander, "that I locked and barred it." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. Mrs. Kinney intervenes. At his apartment, which he reached by noon, he found a note from Mrs. Kinney advising him that she would not be back until late. A salad would be found in the ice box. But his appetite had deserted him, and strong tea and crackers sufficed him. The feeling of exaltation which had carried him along was now dying down, leaving in its place a grim, dogged determination. He saw now very clearly that the time was come to pay for his misdeeds. Dimly he had felt that some day there would have to be a reckoning. He had never thought it so near. It would not have been difficult to make his escape from the man who threatened. With his swift motor he could cross some sparsely peopled border district into Canada. Or he could drop down into South or Central America and there wait until the years brought safety, or he had deteriorated in fiber, as do most men of his race in tropic sloth. The thing that kept him was a chivalrous burning desire to capture Kaufman. Anthony Trent wondered how many men weaker than he had been forced to betray their country as he had very nearly done. And the knowledge that he had even considered such baseness for a moment awakened a deep smouldering wrath in his mind that needed for its outlet some expression of physical force. Kaufman was strongly built and rugged, but it would hardly be a smiling suave spy that he would drag before the police. At least they would go down to ruin together. At 10:30 the bell rang, but the feeble steps that made their weary ascent were those of Mrs. Kinney. When first he flung open the door he hardly recognized her. As a rule neat and quietly dressed in black, she was tonight wearing the faded gingham dress she used for rough work, a dress he had seldom seen. She wore no hat. Instead a handkerchief was on her head. She looked for all the world like some shabby denizen of the city's foreign quarters. "Are you expecting him?" she demanded. "Yes," he said dully. It was a shock not to meet him when he was nerved to the task. She looked at him with a certain triumph in her face that was not unmixed with affection. "He will never come here again." "What do you mean?" he cried. "He's dead." It was curious to note the flash of her usually mild eye as she said it. For a moment he thought the old woman was demented, but her voice was firm. "I followed him on his way here," she went on. "I found out where he lived. As he crossed 8th Avenue at 34th Street I told people he was a German spy. There were a lot of soldiers on their way to the Pennsylvania station and they started to run after him. Then a man tripped him up but he got to his feet and crossed the road in front of a motor truck." "You're certain he was killed?" "I waited to make sure," she said simply. "Nobody knew it was I who started calling him a spy." There was a pause of half a minute. The knowledge of his safety was almost too much for Trent after his hours of suspense. "I suppose you know," he said huskily, "that you've probably saved my life. I didn't do as he wanted me to. I was prepared to denounce him to the police." "But they'd have got you too," she said. "I know," he returned. "I'd thought of that." "Oh, Mr. Trent," she cried. "Oh, Mr. Trent." Then for the second time in the years he had known her she fell into a fit of weeping. When she was recovered and had taken a cup of strong tea she explained how it was she had tracked Kaufman to his home. She had slipped away from Trent at the Grand Central when he was too much worried to notice it. Kaufman walked the half dozen blocks to his rooms in the house occupied by a physician on 48th Street, just west of Fifth Avenue. Applying for work, Mrs. Kinney was engaged instantly for 2 days a week. The need for respectable women was so great that no references were asked. She was thus free of the house and regarded without suspicion. She worked there the whole day but learned nothing from the cook and waitress of Mr. Kaufman. He rented the whole of the second floor and had a fad for keeping it in order himself. It saved them trouble. The maid said vaguely he was in the importing business and very wealthy. It was while Kaufman went down to sign for a registered letter that Mrs. Kinney slipped into the room. There was nothing in the way of papers or documents that she could see. Because he could not bear investigation, Anthony Trent telephoned to the Department of Justice as he had done in the case of Frederick Williams. He felt certain that Kaufman was a highly placed official. But there was no newspaper mention of the raid. Trent was not to know that no news was allowed to leak out for the reason that matters of enormous importance were discovered. He was right in assuming Kaufman to be a personage. The mangled body was buried in the potter's field and those lesser men depending on the monetary support and counsel of Kaufman were thrown into confusion. His superiors in Germany, when later they found the Allies in possession of certain secrets, assumed their agent to be interned. Altogether, Mrs. Kinney deserved her country's thanks. "And now shall we go back to Kennebago?" "Not yet," he said, smiling a little gravely. "Not yet. It may be I shall never see Kennebago again." She looked at him startled. The affairs of the past week had been a great strain to her. "I'm going to enlist," he said. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. Private Trent. Before Trent went to enlist he had an understanding with Mrs. Kinney as to the Kennebago camp. She was to live there and keep the house and gardens in good order until he returned. He had none of those premonitions of disaster which some who go to war have in abundance. Now that the danger of his arrest was gone and Kaufman could never again entrap him, he felt cheerful and light-hearted. "I shall come back," he told the old woman. "I feel it in my bones. But if not, there will be enough for you to live on. I'm seeing my lawyer about it this morning." On the way to the recruiting station, Trent met Weems. "What branch are you going in?" he asked upon learning of Trent's plans. "Where I'm most needed," Trent said cheerfully. "Infantry, I guess." "You can get a commission right away," Weems cried, a sudden thought striking him. "It was in last night's papers. It said that men holding the B.S. degree were wanted and would be commissioned right off the reel. You're a B.S. You wait a bit. Be an officer instead of an enlisted man. I bet the food's better." He was a little piqued that Anthony Trent betrayed so little pleasure at the news. It so happened that Trent had given a deal of thought to this very thing. and his decision was to allow the chance of a commission to go. There was a strain of quixotism about him and a certain fineness of feeling which went to make this decision final. He loved his country in the quiet, intense manner which does not show itself in the waving of flags. To outward appearances and to the unjudging mind, Weems would seem the more loyal of the two. Weems wore a flag in his buttonhole and shouted loudly his protestations, and yet had made no sacrifice. Trent was to offer his life quietly, untheatrically, and he wanted to wear no officer's uniform in case his arrest or discovery would bring reproach upon it. In his mind he could see headlines in the paper announcing that an officer of the United States Army was a notorious, he shuddered at the word, thief. And again there was no certainty in his mind that he would give up his mode of life. In the beginning he had set out to obtain enough money to live in comfort. That, long ago, had been achieved. Then the jewels to adorn his lamp occupied his mind. And now the game was in his blood. He wanted his camp for recreation, but it would not satisfy wholly. When the war was over there would be Europe's fertile fields to work upon. There were many things to aid him in his feeling that the turning over of a new leaf would be useless. Nothing could ever undo what he had done. Try as he might, he would never face the world an honest man. He would go to war. He would be a good soldier. It was in the infantry that they needed men, and Camp Dix received him with others. So insignificant a thing was one soldier that he presently felt a sense of security that had been denied him for years. The experiences he went through in camp were common to all. They were easier to him than most because of his perfection of physical condition. On the whole it was interesting work, but he was glad when he marched along the piers of the Army Transport Service, where formerly German lines had docked, and boarded the Leviathan. Private Trent was going over there. It was common knowledge that the regiments would not yet be sent to France. What they had learned at Camp Dix would be supplemented by a postgraduate course in England. Curiously enough, Trent found himself on the Sussex Downs, those rolling hills of chalk covered with short springy aromatic grasses and flowers. Here were 100 sights and sounds that stirred his blood. 5 generations of Trents had been born in America since that adventurous younger son had set out for the Western world. The present Anthony was coming back to the ancient home of his family under the most favorable circumstances. He was coming back with his mind purged of ancient enmities fostered so long by Britain's foes to further alien causes, coming back to a country knit to his own by bonds that would not easily be broken. It was curious that he should find himself here on the high downs, because it was from this county of Sussex that the Trents sprang. Not far from Lewes was an old house, set among elms, which had been theirs for 300 years. When he was last in England he had made a pilgrimage to it, only to find its owner salmon fishing in Norway. The housekeeper had shown him over it, a big rambling house full of odd corridors and unexpected steps, and he had never failed to think of it with pride. On that visit he had been disappointed to find the village church shut. The sexton was at his midday dinner. Trent had been under canvas only a few days when he obtained leave for a few hours and set out to the church. He counted 3 Anthony Trents whose deeds were told on mural tablets. One had been an admiral, one a bishop, and the third a colonel of dragoons at Waterloo. He sauntered by the old house and looked at it enviously. If I bought that, he thought, I would settle down to the ways of honest men. He shrugged his shoulders. There were many things yet to be done. It was only since he had been in England and seen her wounded that he realized what none can until it is witnessed, the certainty that there must be much suffering before the end is achieved. The men in his company were not especially congenial. They were friendly enough, but their interests were narrow. Trent was glad when the training period was over and he embarked in the troop train for Dover en route to the Western Front. He made a good soldier. More than one of his mates said he would wear the chevrons before many weeks, but he was anxious for no such distinction. At the time his regiment arrived in France, the American troops were at grips with the enemy. It was the first time that they held as a unit part of the line. The Germans, already making their retreat, left in the rear nests of machine gunners to hamper the pursuers. To clear these nests of hornets, to search abandoned cellars and buildings where men or bombs might be lying in wait, was a task far more deadly than participation in a battle. Only iron-nerved men, strong to act and quick to think, were needed. There was a day when volunteers were asked for. Anthony Trent was the first man to offer himself. Under a lieutenant, this band of brave men went about its dangerous task. The casualties were many, and among them the officer. He had made such an impression on his men, and they had gained such favorable mention for gallant conduct, that there was a fear lest the new officer might be of less vigorous and dashing nature. It was work, this nest-clearing danger, that Trent liked enormously. He had come to know what traps the Hun was likely to set, the tempting cigar box, the field glasses, the fountain pen, the touching of which meant maiming at the least. And against some of these trapped men Trent revived his old football tackle and brought them startled to the ground. It was the most stirring game of his life. But one look at the new officer changed his mood. He looked at his lieutenant and his lieutenant looked at him. And the officer licked his lips hungrily. It was Devlin, whom he had laughed at in San Francisco. Instinctively, the man who observed this meeting sensed some pre-war hatred and speculated on its origin. Recollecting himself, Trent saluted. "So I've got a thief in my company," Devlin sneered. "I'll have to watch you pretty close. Looting's forbidden." It was plain to the men who watched Devlin's subsequent plan of action that he was trying to goad the enlisted man into striking him. In France the discipline of the American army was taking on the sterner character of that which distinguished the Allies. No task had ever been so difficult for Anthony Trent as this continual curb he was compelled to put upon his tongue. Devlin had always disliked him. He was maddened at the thought that Trent had taken the Mount Auburn ruby from under his nose. It was because of this Dangerfield had discharged him from a lucrative position. And in the case of the Takowaja emerald it was Anthony Trent who had laughed at him. Many an hour had Devlin spent trying to weave the rope that would hang him. And in these endeavors he had gathered many odds and ends of information over which he chuckled with joy. But first of all he wanted to break his enemy. There was no opportunity of which he did not take advantage. Ordinarily his superior officers would have witnessed this policy and reprimanded him. But conditions were such that their special duties kept Devlin and his men apart from their comrades. Devlin was a good officer and credit was given him for much that Trent deserved. It chanced one night that while they waited for a little wood to be cleared of gas, Devlin and Trent sat within a few feet of one another. It was an opportunity Devlin was quick to seize. "Thought you'd fooled me in Frisco, didn't you?" Trent lighted a cigarette with exasperating slowness. "I did fool you," he asserted calmly. "It is never hard to fool a man with your mental equipment." "Huh?" Devlin grunted. "You've got the criminal's low cunning, I'll admit that, Mr. Maltby of Chicago." He made a labored pretense of hunting for a cigarette case. "Gone," he said, sneering. "Someone's lifted it, but I guess you know where it is. Oh no, I forgot. You weren't a dip, you were a second-story man. Excuse me." He kept this heavy and malicious humor going until Trent's imperturbability annoyed him. "What a change," he commented presently. "Me the officer and you the enlisted man who's got to do as I say. You with your fast auto and your golf and society ways, and me who used to be a cop." Winning no retort from his victim, he leaned forward and pushed Trent roughly. He started back at the white wrath which transfigured the other's face. "Look here, Devlin," Trent cried savagely. "You want me to hit you so you can prefer charges against me for striking an officer and have me disciplined. Listen to this. If you put your filthy hand on me again, I won't hit you. I'll kill you." Towering and threatening he stood over the other. Devlin, who knew men and the ways of violence, looked into Trent's face and recognized it was no idle threat he heard. "That will be a hell of a fine trick," he said, a little unsteadily, "to empty your gun in my back." "You know I wouldn't do it that way," Trent retorted. "Why should I let you off so easily as that?" "Easily?" Devlin repeated. "When I get ready," Trent said grimly, "I shall want you to realize what's coming to you." "Is that a threat?" Devlin demanded. Trent nodded his head. "It's a threat." Devlin thought for a moment. "I'll fix you," he said. "How?" Trent inquired. "You've tried every way there is to have me killed. If there's a doubtful place where some Boche may be hiding with bombs, whom do you send to find out? You send Private Trent. I'm not kicking. I volunteered for the job. I came out to do what I could. My one disappointment is that my officer is not also a gentleman." Devlin's face was now better humored. "I'll fix you," he said again. "I'll see Pershing pins a medal on you, all right." Trent wondered what he meant. And he wondered why for a day or two Devlin goaded him no more. Instead he looked at him as one who knew another was marked down for death and disgrace. It was inevitable that Anthony Trent could never know how near to discovery he was. The odds are against the best breakers of law. The history of crime told him that the cleverest had been captured by some trifling piece of carelessness. Had Devlin some such clue, he wondered? End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham Martin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 31. Devlin's Revenge. There came a night when Devlin's men were called upon to clean out part of a forest from which many snipers had been firing and where machine guns and their crews were known to be. It was work for picked men only, and Trent admitted Devlin made a courageous leader. The Americans met unexpectedly strong opposition. It was only when half their little company was lost that they were ordered to retreat. The way was made difficult with barbed wire and shell-splintered trees. It was one of 100 similar sorties taking place all along the Allied lines, hardly worthy of mention in the press. Trent, when he had gained a clearing in the wood, saw Devlin go down like an ox from the clubbed rifle in a Prussian hand. Trent had put a shot through the man's head almost before Devlin's body fell to the soft earth. He had an excellent chance of escape alone, but he could not leave the American officer who was his enemy to bleed to death among his country's foes. He was almost spent when he reached his own lines and the Red Cross relieved him of his inert burden. They told him Devlin still lived. 3 days later Trent was called to the hospital in which his officer lay white and bandaged. Although Devlin's voice was weak it did not lack the note of enmity which ever distinguished it when its owner spoke to Anthony Trent. "What did you do it for?" Devlin demanded. "Do what?" "Bring me in after that Boche laid me out." "Only one reason," Trent informed him. "Alive, you have a certain use to your country. Dead, you would have none." "That's a lie," Devlin snarled. "I figured it out, lying in this damned cot. You saw I wasn't badly hurt and you knew some of the boys would fetch me in later. You thought you'd do a hero stunt and get a decoration. You reckoned I'd be grateful and let up on you. That was clever, but not clever enough for me. I see through it. You've got away with outguessing the other fellows so far, but I'm one jump ahead of you in this." He paused for breath. "I've got you fixed, Mr. Anthony Trent. And don't you forget it. You think I'm bluffing, I suppose." "I think you're exciting yourself unduly," Trent said quietly. "Take it up when you're well." "You're afraid to hear what I know," Devlin sneered. "You've got to hear it sometime, so why not now?" Trent spoke as one does to a child or a querulous invalid. "Well, what is it?" he demanded. "Never heard of anyone named Austin, did you?" "It's not an unusual name," Trent admitted, but he was no longer uninterested. Conington Warren's butler was so called. and this Austin had met him face to face on the stairway of his master's house on the night that he'd taken Conington Warren's loose cash and jewels. "He's out here," Devlin said, and looked hard at Trent to see what effect the news would have. "You forget I don't know whom," Trent reminded him. "What Austin?" "You know," Devlin snapped. "The Warren butler. I was on that case and he recognized me not a week ago and asked me who you were. He's seen you too. We put two and two together and it spells the pen for you. He was English and although he was over age the British are polite that way. If he said he was 41 they said they guessed he was 41. I went to see him in a hospital before he went west and he told me all about it." Anthony Trent could not restrain a sigh of relief. Austin was dead. "That don't help you any," Devlin cried. "Don't you wish you'd left me in the woods now? That was your opportunity. Why didn't you take it?" "You wouldn't understand," Trent answered. "For one thing you dislike me too much to see anything but bad in what I do. That's your weakness. That's why you've always failed." "Well, I haven't failed this time," Devlin taunted him. "I've laid information against you where it's going to do most good." He hoped to see the man he hated exhibit fear, plead for mercy or beg for a respite. He had rehearsed this expected scene during the night watches. Instead he saw the hawk-like face inscrutable as ever. "I've told the adjutant what I know and what Austin said and he's bound to make an investigation. That means you'll be sent home for trial and I guess you know what that means. I'm going to be invalided home and I'll put in my leave working up the case against you. They ought to give you a stretch of anything from 15 to 20 years. I guess that'll hold you, Mr. Anthony Trent." The other man made no answer. He thought instead of what such a prison term would do for him. He had seen the gradual debasement of men of even a high type during the long years of internment. Men who had gone through prison gates with the same instincts of refinement as he possessed to come out coarsened, different, never again to be the men they were. He would sidle through the gaping doors a furtive thing with cunning, crafty eyes whose very walk stamped him a convict. How could so long a term of years spent among professional criminals fail to besmirch him? He took a long breath. "I'm not there yet," he said. "It's a long way to an American jail and a good bit can happen in 3,000 miles." He was turned from these dismal channels of thought by a hospital orderly who summoned him to the adjutant's quarters. In civil life this officer had been a well-known lawyer who had abandoned a large practice to take upon himself the overwork and worries that always hurled themselves at an adjutant. He had heard of the rescue of Lieutenant Devlin by a man of his company and was pleased to learn that it was an alumnus of his old college who had been recommended for a decoration on that account. He looked at Trent a moment in silence. "When I last saw you," he said, "you won the game for us against Harvard." He sighed. "I never thought to see you in a case of this sort." "I don't know what you mean, sir," Trent answered him. "For some reason or another," the adjutant informed him, "Lieutenant Devlin has preferred charges against you which had better been left until this war is over, in my opinion as a soldier." "I'm still in the dark," Trent reminded him. Captain Sutton looked over some papers. "You are charged," he said, "with being a very remarkable and much sought after criminal. Devlin asserts you purloined a ruby owned by Mr. Dangerfield worth $175,000 and an emerald worth almost as much." "What a curious delusion," Trent commented with calmness. "Delusion?" retorted the adjutant. "What else could it be?" the other inquired. "It might be the truth," the officer said dryly. "Does he offer proofs?" "More, I'm afraid, than you'll care to read," Captain Sutton told him. "You understand, I suppose, that there are certain regulations which govern us in a case like this. I should like to dismiss it as something entirely irrelevant to military duties.
You're a damned good football player, Trent, and they tell me you're just as good a soldier. But an officer has preferred charges against you and they must be given attention. Sit down there for a few minutes."
Devlin, feeling the hour of triumph approaching, lay back in his bed, gloating. The hatred that he bore Anthony Trent was legitimate enough in its way. By some accident or another, Devlin was enlisted on the side of the law and his opponent against it. One was the hunter, the other the hunted. And the hunter was soon to witness the disgrace of the man who had laughed at him, beaten him, cheated him of a coveted position. Naturally of a brave and pugnacious disposition, Devlin saw no lack of chivalry in hounding a man over whom he had military authority. If Trent had been his friend he would have fought for him. But since he was his foe, he must taste the bitterness of the vanquished. So engrossed was he over his pleasurable thoughts that he did not see the distress which came over the face of the nurse who took his temperature and recorded his pulse beat. Nor did he see the hastily summoned physician reading the recently marked chart over the bed. Instead, he was filled with a strange and satisfying exaltation of spirit. Catches of old forgotten songs came back to him. He felt himself growing stronger. He was Devlin the Superman, the captor of Anthony Trent, who had beaten the best of them. It was almost with irritation that he opened his eyes to speak with the doctor, a middle-aged grey man with kindly eyes. "Lieutenant," the doctor said gently, "things aren't going as well with you as we hoped. You should not have exhausted yourself talking. It should not have been allowed." Devlin saw the doctor put his hand under the coverlet. Then he felt a prick in his arm. Dully he knew that it was the sting of a hypodermic. Then he saw coming toward him a priest of his race and faith, and knew he came in that dread hour to administer the last rites of the church. "Doc," he gasped, "am I going?" It was no moment to utter lying comfort. "I'm afraid so." Then he saw an orderly bringing the screen that was placed about the beds of those about to die. When Captain Sutton and Anthony Trent came into the ward, the priest had finished his solemn work and was gone to console another dying man, and the physicians to make one of those quick operations unthinkable in the leisurely days of peace. Trent had no knowledge of what had taken place during his absence. He saw that his enemy was more exhausted, and as he looked he noticed that the eyes of Devlin lacked something of their hate. But it was no time for speculation. Trent saw in the sick man only his nemesis, the instrument which fate was using to rob him of his liberty. He was not to know that here was a man so close to death that hate seemed idle and vengeance a burden. "Lieutenant," Captain Sutton began, "I have here a copy of your statements and the evidence given by Sergeant Austin of the British Army. I will read it to you. Then I shall need witnesses to your signature." "Let me see it," Devlin commanded, and drew the typewritten sheets to him. Then, with what strength was left him, he tore the document across and across again. Captain Sutton looked at him in amazement. "What did you do that for?" he asked. But Devlin paid no heed to him. He gazed into the face of Anthony Trent, the man he had hated. "I made a mistake," said Devlin faintly. "This isn't the man." And with this splendid and generous lie upon his lips, he came to his life's end. Finis. End of chapter 31. End of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal, by Wyndham Martin. Published in 1918.